Hello and welcome to another episode of Whither the Looniversity, the podcast on the miserable state of higher education. It is a podcast of my publication, The Peerless Review, and I'm excited about my guest today. Adam Gussow is with me. He is professor of English and Southern Studies at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. He is also half of the blues duo Satan and Adam, who were the subject of a recent Netflix documentary. And he's the author of many books, most recently, Who's Blues? Facing Up to Race and the Future of Music. He's also published scholarly work in American literature, the African American Review, Pop Music and Society, and many other journals and publications. Adam, welcome. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thanks, Adam. I'm just delighted to be here. And as I mentioned to you, I've listened to 7 out of your 10 podcasts, and I want to catch up on the ones I haven't yet gotten to. So I'm really honored to be here.
Fantastic. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you here is that you strike me as a guy who has some sympathetic feelings towards some of the grievances that sort of the woke campus apparatus are trying to address. But you also seem to be a guy who's pragmatic enough to understand some of the limitations and the problems in sort of the DEI agenda. So I hope that we get into that a little bit today.
Hmm.
But before we start in on that, I ask everybody about their training. You've had a very rich life of playing blues music, doing things at the university. You're also a native New
Hmm.
Yorker who studies Southern studies. So tell us about, how you got here, what your career trajectory was.
Yeah, how did a Manhattan guy end up in Mississippi? I mean, I was born in New York, but I grew up in a town called Congers, a sort of white working class town, basically downstate New York, about 20 miles north of the city. As the son of sort of 2 artist intellectuals, my father was somebody who introduced Bobby Kennedy in '65 when he was thinking about running for Senate. Introduced him to sort of the Hudson River, which needed cleaning up. So environmentalism is a value I still believe in because I know the Hudson River got cleaned up. My mother is a progressive, still alive at 94, a progressive kind of early foodie. She was critiquing the food, sort of the food business, if you will, the food production business, the agribusiness, early 75, and so. My father was a delegate for McGovern. That should tell you all you need to know. I mean, we didn't win the state.
Mhm.
So I grew up in a kind of left liberal family, just understanding intuitively that nobody that we knew voted Republican, and I still haven't ever voted Republican. To be honest, I worked for a liberal Republican once, Charlie Goodell, when he ran. Um, I went to graduate school. I was an undergrad at Princeton and very much sort of becoming a musician at the same time. And I had no particular cultural politics. If I have one memory, it's that when students did the circled Nassau Hall in 1978, Princeton out of South Africa, I was a guy who watched from the sidelines. I tended to be the watch, look, listen, kind of not skeptic about politics, but a step to the center of my parents, if you might say. I mean, I always a little skeptical. Um, and then I ended up in New York, lived with an ardent academic feminist who I was madly in love with. And in the fall of 1982, I went to Columbia and did very well for a couple of years, courses with Edward Said and others.
Mm.
But I was very much an anti-deconstructionist. What I fancied myself at that point was a sort of Edmund Wilson, Malcolm Cowley. Cowley was a hero of mine, a kind of clear thinking, anti-theoretical. I didn't like theoretical discourse, and sort of anti-deconstruction. I wanted to be an independent sort of literary journalist, and I had a cover story in the Boston Review in '84 that was kind of anti-neoconservative. It was like a look at the neoconservatives. A liberal who's been mugged by reality. I had not yet been mugged by reality at all. But I also thought they were mistaken about the threat. They were minimizing the threat of sort of nuclear Armageddon. And of course, we had Reagan at that point who was talking about Armageddon might be around the corner. And so many people forget the single largest protest in American history was June of 1982. And I was there. It was the anti-nuclear. It's 1 million people in Central Park. So to that extent, I flirted with those sorts of, when leftist politics go mass, that sort of made sense to me. And then I dropped out of grad school. The relationship with the feminist ended. That made me at least one increment more cynical about things like that. And I became a musician. I mean, I was a musician, but I reactivated and was a busker in New York and Paris. In the fall of '86, I began playing with a guitar player in Harlem. This is the sort of foundational story of the Satan and Adam thing. And for 3 or 4 years, during a really time of really high racial tension in New York, with Howard Beach and Bensonhurst, Yusef Hawkins being shot in Bensonhurst, Crown Heights, that whole period, I was a street musician, a white guy in Harlem, playing harmonica with this genius, and had very little hassle. One thing that many people assume is like, first of all, they assumed it must have been dangerous, and it didn't feel dangerous. There was just one bad day when somebody put me on the spot. 6 weeks after Do the Right Thing came out. It was a week after Do the Right Thing came out, 2 weeks after Do the Right Thing came out. But for the most part, what it was an experience in just submerging, sort of actually forgetting about my whiteness in a funny way in an all Black environment, and just making music and really getting inside the music. I did not think about going back to grad school for a while. I mean, I was out, but then at some point, the musical career, which became a touring career, I had been reading a whole lot of African American lit, trying to make sense of my experience in Harlem. And at a certain point, I think I read Bell Hooks, an essay called Eating the Other, which attributed horrible bad faith to any white person who had anything to do with Black culture in some way. And it was all just consuming. You want to just consume us. It's cannibalizing. And I remember reading Greg Tate's essay, Everything But the Burden, at some point, what white people take from Black culture. And I had thought about going back to grad school, not to be a blues scholar, but because I had been involved in what I thought of as a musical version of beloved community. And that phrase, Ira Zepp, and there was another scholar who wrote about King, when I came across that phrase, it really moved me. Beloved community, the true interrelatedness. Because one thing that I felt playing music was that despite the talent level differential, I mean, I was playing with a genius, and I'm not a musical genius. I'm just a guy who learned quick and tried really hard and played hard. But I was conscious that music is a place where that could be worked out. I mean, we were family to each other. We were touring America. We were traveling on the road. And I think that experience of what I'd call transracial creativity, if I may, I mean, the word transracial these days could get you in trouble probably. Back then it felt real to me. And so I went back to grad school, I applied, I actually decided not to restart Columbia, but go back to Princeton as a grad student this time, and was there, and then had a transformation that I didn't expect. So I wanted to go and sort of explore transracial creativity. And then in the fall of that first year in '94, well, of course, the O.J. Simpson thing had just happened. So America was sort of splintering before me. And then that next fall in '95, the O.J. was found, not guilty. And I was in Nell Painter's African American intellectual history class when that happened, and thinking, what a difficult time. That was when I began to write the memoir that basically was about the relationship. But what happened to me basically was that I began to think about blues and violence. I was one of those white people whose experience of blues, as real and rich as it had been, it had never taken me into a deep South confrontation with a long history. This is where you say, to the extent that I'm sympathetic to something that the wokes might be sympathetic to, it's that, yeah, for a long time, I've been paying attention to horrific racial violence in the South. I mean, I went to the original Without Sanctuary exhibition when it was just before it got to the New York Historical Society. I was one of the least scandalized people because I'd been studying these narratives. There weren't a lot of scholars doing it, but there were a handful. Philip Dray and Trudier Harris were writing about this, but not in connection with blues. And that became basically my dissertation, my first book. And I'm going on at length, but let me just say sort of where this goes, which is that I thought of myself as an African-American lit guy when I went on the job market, and in fact got a job at Vassar as a visiting assistant professor, and that lasted for 2 years before I got the Ole Miss job. It was English and Africana Studies. And I had a project that made me that kind of Garrett Felber golden boy among Black intellectuals. There were Houston A. Baker blurbed mean, I'll tell you a story. I actually put on the way I got the blurb on that book was that in 99, I decided that it was sort of careerist, but also what I was interested in. It was the 15th anniversary of blues ideology in Afro-American literature by Houston A. Baker Jr., who subsequently, of course, becomes a terrible problem during the Duke rape lacrosse thing. But that was all in the future. And I invited him, I said, would you come and chair this thing? I know he was a past president of the MLA. And I said, would you be a commentator? I'm going to put together a great blues panel. And so I did that with Arthur Flowers and Paul Guerin, who's a scholar, and a number of others. And he came and he chaired it. And I actually did a sort of critical appreciation of his book. And I said, interestingly enough, the one thing he leaves out is the violence. Little did I know that he would take that idea, which he basically agreed in that book that he leaves out racial violence. And then he came right back. Within a couple of years, he had a special issue of American Literature that was all about turning south again. It was all about basically we need to pay attention to this stuff. And so it resonated. My point basically is that that's sort of where I was, but I was always willing to be skeptical. And one chapter in my book, there were several that were sort of problematic. I mean, the chapter on Hurston was about why Zora Neale Hurston felt it was important to depict herself being chased at knife point by a Black woman in two different texts out of the juke joints that she'd been investigating. Why was that important to her? And so I write about that in Who's Blues. And the sort of guns and knives element of blues violence was something that I explored very frankly. I said, look, it was an occupational hazard. I had, as a blues musician, I'm always thinking about it from the perspective of the blues guys, or blues women too, but blues guys who were in those clubs. And violence was an ever-present threat if you were a Southern blues musician. Everybody was armed. The white law wasn't going to take care of a beef that you might have with some other Black person, right? So it was hands-on in a true transracial Southern way. Anyway, it's a long answer to a question, but that's sort of in a nutshell. So I'll try to go.
One of the things that I read about of yours was a description of an episode that happened at an anti-racism training session. And I wanted to have you recount that experience. And then I probably will have some questions for you about it, depending on what you say.
Absolutely. So, and I ended up writing a piece about this over the last couple of years that several of my friends said, you shouldn't, good friends said, you shouldn't publish this. And I have zero regrets that I published it. So I had that first book, Seems Like Murder Here, Southern Violence and the Blues Tradition. And I wanted to go in a different direction. And one thing that I became conscious of in the late 90s was this discourse. They were moving towards the check more than one box thing. They were moving towards you're Black, not just Black or white, but Black and white, or other things. The destigmatization of multiracial and biracial identity was a part of Clinton's era and what followed. I wanted to do a book, and it was sort of on modalities of racial healing. Remember that phrase, racial healing, kind of a quaint phrase that I don't think anybody really uses these days. That's so early 2000s, right? But it was big then, and I had like 8 chapters mapped out, and one of them, so there were site-specific commemorations, where you go to a place where there was a lynching in Moore's Ford, Georgia, or something, and then whites and Blacks get together and hold hands and say a prayer. I don't want to trivialize. It was just there were many different ways. There was Christian yoke fellows where Black and white Christians get together and do things. But there's one mode that I sort of didn't really like, that I thought I needed to pay attention to, which was instead of dissolving race, instead of taking the field sister seriously and sort of let's get beyond race, because if where race is, it's produced by racism. That's why we need races with hardened edges. They were people who held workshops, usually with the word whites or whiteness somewhere in there, or allies somewhere in there. And they were workshops where people heightened their whiteness. It came out of whiteness studies. And so the classic thing would be you walk in the room and somebody says, hello, white people. And it's a room full of, I guess, we're all white people. We sort of assume that, even though, of course, there were a lot of people who might theoretically be passing and not even knowing it. But white people. I went to one, I'm not going to say where it was, when I fictionalized it. By the way, I need to pause and just tell my son, Sean, he's just coming home. You're going to need to go in your room because I'm on Zoom. Okay. Yeah. And I contacted the organizers, and it was, I'll just say that I fictionalized it as being in the West Coast. It was somewhere else, but I'm not going to talk about it or give the title, except that I called it White, what did I call it? White Anti-Racist Allies in Training, My Social Justice Troubles and Yours, playing a play on Norman Podhoretz's article. And so I decided I would go, I flew to the place where it was, and they understood what I was going to be there to do. It was, and they explained to people, this guy is, I've been to some Omega Institute encounter group type things, the heart opening workshop. So I was like, I'll do the work, but I'm also an academic investigator. But I'm here, I'm participating in good faith, fully. That was the understanding. And I'm not bringing a recorder I'm not recording it. I'll take notes, and people understand that that's what I'm doing. I just want to get a sense of how it worked. And on the first day, they introduced us. They did a bunch of things. And there was a workbook. One thing that unnerved me about the workbook was that it actually got several key things, key elements of Black history wrong, like wildly off on slavery numbers. And they spelled, it was like they spelled Du Bois wrong or something. It was that level of yikes. Okay. There were three people I've come to understand were sort of on the spectrum, sort of, I guess the non-binary people. I wouldn't have had that term then. Nobody had that term then, but I just said, well, they're sort of boyish, but I think they're female. I don't know who they are, right? But they're just part of the thing. There weren't that many men. We're all white, obviously. There were two organizers. There weren't that many men. And there were a number of gay women. So as we sort of, the self-identifications, you sort of get a sense, and I'm the oldest guy, and I'm the oldest white guy, and the word Princeton is associated with me and other things. Then we were given an intersectional grid, primitive intersectional grid, and with, the power thing. And that's the moment where I thought, okay, well, you're the old white guy with the word Princeton somewhere in there. That's your education. And you're sort of low man on the totem pole in intersectional term problem. And I thought about Du Bois.
You're the high man on the totem.
You're the, well, right. How does it feel to be a problem? Which of course is Du Bois' foundational sentence. And I'm African-American scholar, studies scholar. And it was sort of, okay. And then I ended up telling a story, and the story, we were sort of a share kind of thing. At some point, I think sort of the middle of the first, there was a Friday night, so in the middle of the big long Saturday, right? Kind of late morning or early afternoon. I think it was late morning. And I told a story, and it happened to involve the fact that while my African-American colleague was on maternity leave, I had been given the second half of the African-American Lit survey and what it was like to teach that. And I described an encounter where one of the girls, one of the younger Black women in class, was telling me about, hey, do you believe this bullshit? There's actually a place in Mississippi near where I live in Winona, which is where Fannie Lou Hamer was beat down. In Winona, that's like still white folks only. Isn't that ridiculous? And I was like, it is. And I said, why don't you come in tomorrow? She said, we should go in there and, march on it. And I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea. So I said, come in tomorrow, I'll give you the floor and tell us what you're envisioning. Now, to me, this is like, you're giving up power. Shouldn't you be doing that and making a space for a voice? All those things, the lefty things that I actually thought were great, fine. And I told the story. I told how she'd come in. She made way for her. When I'd finished telling the story, what happened is we ended up having a wonderful conversation in that class. Felt like something important had happened. The Blacks and the whites together felt kind of unified. Like we're totally off the intersectional grid. And not long after that, I told that story. Basically, everybody got upset. They got so upset that the two organizers said, we're going to do a little something. We're going to improvise a little something. Adam, you're going to sit and you're not going to say a word. You can have one ally. I don't know whether she was picked for me or I picked her. And we're going to go around the circle as people see fit, and everybody's going to have a chance. And I'm caricaturing only slightly to tell you why you pissed them off and why they're hurt by what you said. And you can't say a thing. And it began to go around the room. Now, there was one interesting thing, which is I realized from earlier conversations that not only did people here actually not know many black people, and of course I'd had this long experience, but but that they weren't necessarily here to achieve social justice vis-a-vis black people. This was the single most startling, disturbing thing. They were there, the non-binary people were there partly because they were unhappy with how the world was treating them. And they saw in black people a kind of proletariat that I think could substitute. I'm analyzing, maybe a little overanalyzing, but that was part of what was going on. And it bothered me. It was like, this should be about us healing ourselves as a cohort, creating, getting deep into the work, but also bonding as a cohort, and creating a different kind of whiteness, if you will. It doesn't have to be an anti-racist whiteness exactly. But it has to be a more awakened whiteness. And we should pool our experience. I wasn't trying to hold court, if you will. I wasn't trying to, pull rank. But clearly they felt that I was trying to pull rank. And so at a certain point, I realized that the anger that was being directed at me had nothing ultimately in any rational way to do with what I'd actually said. It was an anger that wasn't about me. It was, to some extent, maybe about that intersectional identity. The guy they imagined, maybe they imagined that this guy would be somebody other than he was. But it got so evil, and that's the word I felt ultimately had to use, that the two organizers began to look aghast, and they yanked it to a halt. And it was clear they felt they'd made a mistake. They said later they'd made a mistake. They'd underestimated. I didn't have the term struggle session. I didn't know about the speak bitterness stuff that the Chinese Communist Party, and I don't know whether they did either. That wasn't something I could ask them about. We had a long phone meeting, which I recorded the next day, and I didn't have any basis for understanding what happened. I mean, that we recorded later in the week when I was back home. What I will say is that, and when I wrote this up, what happened was at a certain point, I got pissed off. And I'm going to encourage anybody who finds themselves in this sort of thing, who realizes there's something wrong here and it's not you. And I said to him, basically, wait a minute. I said, this is bullshit. If I was on the street in Harlem and I'd read Black and White Styles in Conflict and I knew about how things work, somebody yells in your face, you yell in their face, and eventually everybody's had their say, but nobody's been silenced. And I said, in a sense, in Harlem, you couldn't do this to me. I said, this is the whitest thing I've ever seen. And that broke the spell in a weird way. And I don't know whether that was what led them to yank it to a stop. Maybe that was. I think it might have been. Maybe. So that proceeded. They yanked it to a stop. And eventually I ended up talking with one of the people. But eventually it all kind of simmered down and we made peace and it was okay. But it was okay partly because I got fucking pissed off, if I can use my French.
Well, let me pause you for just
sure.
a second here, because this
push
interests
back.
me.
Yeah.
So, like, somebody with my politics would know better than to attend such a thing to begin with, right? It seems to me you're right that these white people that you encountered there are not interested in doing the work, as it's called. But what they're interested in, from my perspective, is two things. They want to give each other a pat on the back, right? Because they're so enlightened to be at an anti-racist thing. And they're seeking sort of vicariously to purchase some absolution, right? They're sort of racked with white guilt, and this is how they can signify to themselves that I'm one of the good ones. And so, like, I haven't been to, there's been many of them. I haven't been to a department meeting on anti-racism stuff in a couple of years now, because I just flat out refuse. And, your story kind of makes me feel justified in this. Let me ask you this question. Sure. Why should people like me deal with these people in good faith rather than just seeing the grift?
Well, so understand that this was 2003. So part of what my point here was that this is a distant early warning signal. This is when it was still very much it was a left-leaning academic enterprise, a left-leaning activist enterprise that sort of does these training sessions. So I went into the belly of the beast circa 2003. I think the signal thing here is that it's moved into government. It's moved into universities. My own university, I mean, I was going to be on any search committee. I needed to do a certain training, and it wasn't that bad. But I have to be honest, I think many of us over this last 3, 4, 5 years, but certainly since the summer of George Floyd, the summer of 2020, think many of us have said, what would be a bridge too far? Live not by lies. You know, the Barry Weiss is the Solzhenitsyn quote. A lot of people are recycling it. Live not by lies. Like, what? It's one thing for me to be able to sit silently, but is there something that I could be forced to take part in that would be the place where I'm like the guy, like the airplane, steward guy who goes out the escape hatch on the side. I mean, that kind of moment where you go, I'm gone, right? We shouldn't be like that. But I've thought about that, and I think that would be a Rubicon would be if I'm expected to take part in a session and it begins to go in that direction, and it begins to, if I'm forced to say that, yes, I think that all white people are, are in some way saddled with this guilt, this primal guilt from the beginning, and entirely apart from how they've lived their lives to date, that would be, I mean, I'd leave the meeting, but I could imagine, again, I don't think it's going to happen. University of Mississippi's, believe it or not, it's a little more benign. We're not Williams,
right?
We're not some of these elite institutions where I think it's probably much tougher. We're not the Sandia Corporation, those sorts of trainings have not come to Ole Miss. But could you re-ask your question? I'm not sure if I fully addressed it.
Why should I deal with these people in good faith and not just assume that they're actually interested in exacerbating racial grievance, right? I think that that's, to me, the aim is these people do not want resolution. Once there's resolution, there's no more victims, and once there's no more victims, there's no more power. And what these people want is power.
That's true. Yeah, you have. I mean, one question you can ask questions, and I do want to tell you a story about my own English department with the preface that I really get along beautifully with my current chair, with the head of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and partly because I've been honest with them about where I am. They've, not sure I'll share this link. I don't know. Maybe I will. I haven't said anything too outrageous yet. Where was I going to go? Why should we, in good faith? I think here's a reason. Well, one thing is to maintain sanity. In other words, I know it may sound counterintuitive, but I want to give you an example. I looked this up. In our English department at Ole Miss, we had a meeting that was it was a sort of draft statement that was called a statement of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we were, comments were asked. We were asked for comments. Faculty of the English Department at the University of Mississippi embraces diversity, inclusion, and equity as central to the scholarly mission and humanistic values of this department. Our commitment to inclusion means that we strive to foster an open, self-reflective, and supportive. Okay, our commitment to equity. Here, actually, what bothered me right off the bat was this. Our commitment to diversity means that we work to ensure that our students, faculty, and staff represent an array of salient experiences that mark human difference. So why we're founded on difference. And that struck me as philosophically not something that I entirely liked. I wished it could be, so I suggested a rewrite, didn't go through. Including differences of race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, gender expression characteristics, and physical ability. What's missing? Well, obviously, viewpoint diversity is missing. But so I came up with they just didn't, here's what I did. I said, well, I had an incredible meeting with a guy named Andrew Newby, who is the head of the veterans thing. And I thought, they've left veterans off. Do I have any justification for coming to the meeting and saying, can we find some way, well, veterans choose to be veterans, right? It's not, but they're incredibly diverse. And I had an amazing meeting. I went and met a guy I had not previously met, he has an English PhD from Auburn. And he's a vet. And I went, so here's what I did. I looked at the actual things university-wide for pathways, for equity, pathways to equity, underrepresented groups. Okay. And what I found on that group was adult learners, veterans. Okay. So underrepresented groups. I kept poking around in the document and I found the bias education and response team. So if there's a hate crime on campus, bias-related incidents are defined as alleged threats or acts of harassment or intimidation, whether verbal, written, or physical, which are motivated by a bias against a person or property in whole, blah, 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 blah. person's age, color, ability, marital status, national or ethnic origin, political affiliation, race, religion, sex, including pregnancy, socioeconomic status, okay, class is good, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, veteran status, family, medical, or genetic makeup or information, intellectual perspective. So viewpoint diversity. So what I did is I said, look, I'm going to call, this is going to get me in trouble, I'm going to call their bluff. I believe in diversity. I believe we have a better conversation in the classroom. Not, when we have not just a range of differences that way, but when we have vets who've actually been in battle. They've taught me some amazing things in classrooms. And believe it or not, vets are an incredibly heterogeneous group. Andrew Newby, I'd like to invite Andrew Newby to come in and talk to us about that. And viewpoint diversity, I think, would be good. Here's how I leveraged it. I said, I've got a rewrite that I think works, right? I'm going to read this, and I want to read we recognize that the University of Mississippi is situated on the ancestral home of the Chickasaw Nation, and that people enslaved to wealthy patrons, this is the Ole Miss statement, right? Wealthy patrons of the institution carried out the construction of the campus itself. We further acknowledge the deep history of racial strife at the campus, which served in 1962 as a violent struggle for the integration of higher education in this state and a flashpoint in the struggle to desegregate U.S. American society more generally. And then I said, how about this, just adding the sentence, for this same reason, we salute the bravery of U.S. Air Force veteran James Meredith, acknowledging the transformative effect he had on this university, and we welcome military veterans as an historically underserved community that exemplifies diversity. I just put it. So why should I? No dice. Right? I mean, you've got a black man who changes the institution in absolutely anti-racist ways, and he's a vet, and they wouldn't take. And no. And then, so I realized, and I don't, if this gets back, I love my chair. I get along great. The diversity committee's fine, but to my mind, I called their bluff because they're not really serious about diversity. What they're serious about, and this is important, in the aftermath of the Garrett Felber case, some people may remember there was a guy on campus who was a hard left guy who was not sort of rehired because of a dispute with the chair of the history program. It was somebody I know, and she's actually cool, and she helped with our chair search. She's a good person, Noel. In the aftermath of that, I think 3,000 anti-racist academics from around the country, around the world, signed a petition saying we'll never set foot on your campus. And I think that panicked the administration. I think the English department felt that as stigma. Oh my God. In this woke moment, everybody's seeing us as the Antichrist, and nobody will come here. And so I think this is for grad students. I think this was designed solely for the purpose of assuring grad students we are a righteous department. I'll say that to the face of my chair and the diversity committee person. Again, they're friends, I love them, but that's what this is about. It's about reassuring ourselves and potential graduate students in our righteousness, in our stainlessness, no sin from us. And that's I have a problem with that. I don't think it produces the best conversations from a pedagogical perspective. So that's one thing.
One thing that I ask myself constantly, and maybe I have some thoughts about this, is that the American university is the most inclusive, equitable, accessible, anti-racist place in American life. And at the same
time, it's hard to argue with that. Yes, it's hard to argue with that.
At the same time, they are utterly transfixed by their own inadequacies in these realms, that they're not equitable enough, they're not inclusive enough, right?
What's that about? Why do you think that is? I mean, I think I agree with you. So why those two things, how do they coexist? Is it ideology that's undergirding all this? Is it
I mean, that's
intersectional?
What it is to me. It's
intersectionality gone mad.
It's part of it. I think is the administrative, bureaucratic elements of the university, which have expanded dramatically their presence on the American campus, and they are the ones. I think people think it's the students who push this the most. That's not my experience of it. My experience of it is that it has institutional endorsement of kind of a woke corporatism that now worms its way into, like I had a committee meeting this morning, right, with my department. what did we spend the time talking about? What do the department's objectives need to be? Well, apparently the top of the order of business for us is an anti-racism statement. Apparently that's really what the English department at University of Houston downtown really needs to get on.
Okay.
And my point is just like,
Yeah.
like, first of all, what is the function of explicating your anti-racism? Would any would any, I think it's presumed that we're anti-racist, and so I'm not sure why this needs to be stated. And yet you're reading the document from your university, and it seems like, again, these things that you would assume, yes, of course we're inclusive, of course we're diverse. Like, why does it need to be explicated?
Well, here's the other thing that I thought is, look, if I'm, I mean, I happen to be kind of a, we should talk about what I am, right? I'm sort of an Obama era liberal, I guess, a Kennedy liberal stuck in the progressive age. But I can read a statement like this from the standpoint of somebody who is center right, somebody who's thinking about coming to grad school, and I can know that they're reading this and going, oh, geez, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if and at the same time we're losing majors, right? Southern Studies is actually doing well, but English department and other humanities programs are losing majors. You think maybe it would help if we reached out and made clear that we are a big tent and we're open to, we believe in genuine diversity in the classroom and open to a range. We might actually get a few more English majors coming in from the other side, right? So, but I think one thing that doesn't get talked about is, and I think that's part of this spiral, I don't want to call it a death spiral, but it's a, where we know that sort of that Trump coming in absolutely set a fire underneath progressives, and I think a lot of people who saw Obama as a kind of father figure, a kind of transracial father figure, were horrified when Trump came in, and it just panicked them and it froze them. But one thing that's going on is that there's a limited supply of top flight African American academics, so there's competition for them. We've had B. Brian Foster was one of my colleagues in Southern Studies. He was an Ole Miss guy. He went to Chapel Hill, I think, for his PhD, and then he came back. He was with us, and then he ended up leaving. He got a better offer somewhere else. He may be at Chapel Hill. I don't actually remember exactly, or Duke. One of those two. He's a great sort of Research One institution. So what that might tend to do is mean that when there's a competition and the best people, the best diverse candidates are being sucked away, sort of sucked up the ladder, it might lead to a certain amount of panic in institutions that have a slightly harder time holding on to talent like that. I think that's an underappreciated element of where we are is this kind of competition.
I think the exclusionary point that you talked about is part of the function of these things. I mean, they would rather not have the majors if they're Trump supporters, right? They would rather not train them.
They don't want to have to break them. You're right. Yeah.
Well, they were fearful that they couldn't, right?
Right.
So as somebody, totally. I did not vote for Trump in 2016, but I did in 2020. And in fact, like, Trump's, I don't think, really far enough to the right for me at this point. And you have to understand that makes me an embarrassment.
I'm still talking to you though, but I mean,
yes,
this is why we are modeling American discourse.
Yes, and my point is this though, is like, I am an embarrassment to the discipline. And universities, once people like me get into the professorate, that's not supposed to happen, because what that is that all people who think what I think aren't lunatics, right? If they could become a professor and function, at a high level in sort of peer-reviewed publications, that's not supposed to happen. And so I think that part of this discourse, right, the potential right-wing grad student that you were talking about, the function is for that guy to look at the statement, and say, oh,
good point.
Forget it, I'm out of here.
Yeah, good point.
And the sad thing is that they would, they'd rather have English as a discipline, continue the decline that's been going on for the last 50 years than make any reform. Because essentially now, you might feel differently, and if you do, you should say so. But I mean, English as a discipline at this point is probably about 90% activism. That's like what it is. Um,
It probably is, and I think I haven't gone to the American Studies Association meeting in about 5 or 6 years. It was well, 5 years. It was clear to me last time I was there that I absolutely was whatever the bull elephants that are just about to be kicked out into the back pasture. That was sort of the look and the vibe. Um, uh, I was there to support a grad student, and it was fun, And I went and busked. It was in L.A., and I busked on Venice Beach. I took advantage of the boondoggle, I suppose. But I haven't been to MLA in a few years, and I probably. But you're right, though, and I do read PMLA. I glance at PMLA. But yes, 90% activism. Yeah, and I feel sorry for younger academics who surely must be corralling certain errant thoughts, away from the places that they can't go. For all of this, I think it's extremely important. I mean, I remember the summer of 2020 and how somebody in my department in June of that year posted links to Dropbox or Box with um, Ken D'Angelo, right? Robin D'Angelo and Ibram X Kendi, and how one ought to read these things, and utterly kind of unvetted. Nobody was saying, well, we ought to read and think about them and critique them. No, I was sort of read and just do that. And I think
read and obey.
in that moment, and I wonder if I'm sure I'm speaking to others, to those who listen to your podcast. There was a kind of fear that went through me that was very unfamiliar fear. I'm a guy who's used to speaking his mind, and I had been watching. I made a note to myself. I'd sort of been watching the Yale Halloween thing with Nicholas Christakis in 2015, Evergreen State. Where you sort of are watching aghast, Um, I, even as places like Ole Miss with the Confederate monument, well, we had some neo-Confederates march on the university and do it, and it scared people. And so we eventually had a really good thing there, and we happened to have a Confederate graveyard on campus. So I thought it was great. Nobody tore down the damn statue. They just lifted it up from center position right by the Lyceum and moved it to the graveyard and then hit it. They had to build something so the black football players wouldn't have to look at it in its relocated position. But it's fine. There are some good things that come when people dialogue, and I thought we actually handled that really well. But in terms of fear, that summer of 2020, I have a YouTube presence. I'm a sort of harmonica guy, and I've been one for 13, 14 years. And I lost my voice. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to get in my car and talk harp. I didn't quite know what I was about. And I heard people around me saying, listen to Black voices, listen to Black voices. And so what I did is I was lucky enough somehow to stumble across Sam Harris's Can We Pull Back from the Brink? And I would urge anybody who didn't get to that, go back to June 13th of 2020 and listen to how he talks through the issues as he felt and saw them at that point. And you have to say, for better or worse, he was a brave man and a thinker's thinker. And what he did was he says, I could have had, instead of taking the heat for this, I could have invited, and then he mentioned Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, Camille Foster, and a number of Black thinkers that I've come to really admire. John McWhorter, who I knew about before, didn't really appreciate him fully. He visited Ole Miss once, I thought he was kind of dry back in 2010. Now he's absolutely essential. And so, yeah, I began to listen to Black voices, but they weren't the approved voices. They were another cohort, including some race abolitionists like Foster, who were trying to sort of get us past this hypertrophied identification with race. You had Eric Smith on your podcast. I'm bringing him. I'm working with the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom, which has an awfully Republican, conservative, scaife foundation kind of. It's not, but it's that. And one thing I would encourage people to do on the contemporary college campus, people who might be like me, who thought of themselves as liberals, they've moved to the center, they even still have progressive dreams in some respect, but there's just something crazy going on. I would encourage them to sort of look around on their campuses and say, well, is there some productive alliance that we could make here? It might be that, you can reach out. And so Eric Smith and a woman named the Reverend Starlette Thomas, who is very powerful, very uncompromising, very radical, who comes from the Koinonia kind of utopian. This sort of Koinonia was a Southern racial utopian experiment, and she's contributed an introduction or a preface to a book about Clarence. I'm forgetting the name of the guy, but she's going to come and sort of help remind us, and I'm calling it the dream of beloved community, kind of remind us that maybe King got something right. And that's really my own, I mean, when people say, where are you coming from now? I've been interracially married for 18 years. I've got a 16-year-old son who, plays the euphonium and knows 40 out of John Philip Sousa's 111 marches. I mean, and he can read, I can't, I'm the illiterate blues guy, right? That's what I do. But King did have a dream. There was something that was working. We were moving in a direction, including that racial healing moment of the late 90s and early 2000s. And of course, we know what happened, which was, and I've written about, from a skeptical centrist perspective, about Trayvon Martin, about Michael Brown. I think the Obama DOJ actually got the Michael Brown thing right. Which is to say, well, I think they got it right, and you should go and read that long report if you're not sure what I mean by that. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Black Lives Matter. What happened was, and it's been analyzed ad infinitum in various ways, with the rise of social media and the sort of viralization of a certain kind of clip, the sort of a Rodney King kind of clip. The data doesn't really matter in that respect. What matters is the drama. There's a book that's probably worth remembering that's out there, which is called, I think it's called Racial, the subtitle is Racial Melodramas from Uncle Tom to O.J. Simpson. It's a female academic, and she's talking about this age-old idea that Americans have. They need this scene of Blackness being beaten down. It serves an important function. It may serve some constructive functions, but it also serves as sort of purgative. It sort of purges emotion and conducts emotion. And there's a weird way in which what happened with George Floyd, she didn't, she wasn't writing about that, but it absolutely fits within that racial melodrama script. And it was impossible to resist. I think historians will be trying to figure out what happened in the summer of 2020. But one thing that happened was that a certain strong incoming stream of activist thought, and I think it was in the educational schools, which is where your perspective is so useful. The e-school people, but I think that just people said, this is our moment, and I don't know whether it's the Leninist concept, but it was clearly the moment to move, and everybody moved, and that's where we are now. Where are we now, Adam? I mean, that's where we are, but it was that one window. And it was legitimate outrage, but it was also hyped outrage, and there were all kinds of other currents going on. And I think it got us. I mean,
there was a lot happening in that moment. COVID was a part of it. Trump was a part of it.
Yes.
And I was reading your stuff, and I'm going to read back a quote to you of your own, and ask if you feel differently now, because this kind of. My mind jumped straight to 2020 when I read it. You say, this was in your piece about Michael Brown, by the way. Only by taking to the streets and burning Ferguson did they ensure that the entire nation and Obama's Justice Department would take their abuse seriously. And it sounds to me like this passage is essentially, taking the pro-riot perspective, which many people embraced in the summer of 2020. And as somebody who thinks that, they've treated January 6th like it was like our democracy was teetering on the head of a pin, but nobody blinked an eye to say, it was mostly peaceful while the fires burned all summer long in 2020.
I agree. I mean, we may see January 6th differently, but we certainly agree that there was a terrible problem. Let me explain how I was deploying that. So what I did is wrote an article about basically two true tales told by the Obama holder DOJ. So they came up with two reports in the aftermath of Ferguson. And my argument was based, if riots hadn't happened, we wouldn't have these reports. Now, I know that's
so one report for our audience says, all right, Michael Brown didn't die the way people thought that he died.
Right. And it was
the second one.
The second one said the Ferguson Police Department. This is where I part with Shelby Steele and Eli Steele. I love Eli Steele, and I agree with most of Steele, but I think that
he's great.
He's terrific, and the white guilt thing. I have not actually read that book, but there's no question that concept is relevant, really relevant, and it's a sort of undercurrent. So
Sorry, I
I think,
interrupted you. Go ahead.
well, I was going to say that. So the one DOJ report on the death of Michael Brown said basically that if when you look at all the ballistics and you take all of the trustworthy eyewitness statements, the hands up, don't shoot narrative was false. And in fact, it was 6 black informants who ended up saving the day by saying basically, well, they'll kill me if I tell you this in front of them, but here's what I saw. And basically what people saw was they saw him reach through and punch Darren Wilson. They saw him try to wrench something, and then he ran away, and he turned around, he briefly put his hands up, then he put his hands down, and he charged. And Wilson took his gun and he fired twice in a controlled way. And Brown hesitated and kept going. And Wilson took it again, fired it. Finally, Wilson fired it a third time when Brown kept coming, and it was the kill shot. One of the older black men who was a witness for the DOJ said basically, I would have shot that motherfucker sooner than Wilson. So they all agree. They saw what happened. And they began to talk in the aftermath, and the black community, people in the community said, basically called them names and said, you better get the F out, right? So that's one report we have as a result of the rioting. The other, and I think it's crucial to understand, was, and I trust the report, from the quotes that they got, the emails that they got, was that the Ferguson Police Department was uniquely, I hope it was uniquely racist. It was preying on the community. It was the way that they handled expired licenses and traffic stops and stuff was to try to make money. It was really bad. And so the community knew that there was a terrible relationship between them. They were and their police department. They were spring-loaded to believe anything about Darren Wilson. Wilson was the black swan, so to speak, he's the cop who actually, it appears from the Obama holder DOJ, it appears that he actually used force in a measured and reasonable, a justified way, and they found nothing that could impeach him. So that my point was basically, it's a weird historical irony, and I don't countenance the riot, but the riot had the unintended effect of bringing heavy DOJ presence in and a sincere commitment to finding the truth. And I believe, given that it was Obama, it was Holder, they were going to find as much as they could. They did, but they were honest enough to tell the truth about Wilson. I think that's fallen completely into the memory hole. I don't think anybody in the sort of collective memory of Michael Brown, and this is where Eli and Shelby Steele's documentary is very good. They got most of that, yeah. But that's what I meant. I call a riot.
Yeah. Well, I think that the refusal to end the riots in 2020 was very much a part of more or less the state's attempt to make 2020 as absolutely miserable as they could in every way that they could, right, in order to ensure the desired outcome in 2020.
The presidential election, you mean?
Yes, right. I think that, had it, like, if similar riots were unfolding right now, those would be put down promptly in a matter of days, the way that they could have been. Right, because we have the right guy in charge, so they tell me. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, actually, we don't even have time for all the questions I wanted to ask you, but at the beginning of this, you talked about your interest in racial violence. And this is a question that interests me of, well, how do we define what constitutes racial violence? And I think about this, so, like, was there any aspect of, take for example, the Michael Brown conflict, right, like, that was defined in any meaningful way by racial considerations, or is it just that we have a black man or a white cop and therefore it's necessarily racial violence? And I feel like we've kind of, at least personally, it feels like we've kind of lost this distinction. It's like, if there's a black person and a white person, then it's racial, right? I think this is, like, for example, like George Floyd's case. This is another one. It's like, well, we have a black person and a white person, ergo it's a racial event. I'm not sure I buy it. But I wonder how you define it as somebody who studies this, is really well read on it.
Mm.
How do we know racial violence when we see it?
Well, what's interesting is one question to ask might be, so if there is this paradigm, right, and it's part of the racial melodrama, which would be the white guy with the, whether it's Simon Legree, right, with the whip, or whether it's Darren Wilson with the gun. There's white and black, and so there's a sort of outlaw hero on one side. He's somebody. What happens when the cop is black? So, I'm actually working on a long research piece right now. In other words, how does leftist ideology then take that into account? And I'm working on a long piece. It's taken a long time, on Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. And I'm interested in what he left out. I don't want to give away everything I'm working on, but the book hinges on the killing of a friend of his, a guy he knew at Howard, who was sort of from the black bourgeoisie, and brilliant smile, 6'2", seemed to have the world just ahead of him, right? And his mother was a doctor, Philadelphia, and he's killed by a cop. And the way that Coates tells the story is he's killed by a cop. Eventually, Coates tells you that the cop was black, but he does that. He does it in a grudging way, not after introducing, and to the point where many people did not know that when they sort of first heard about he underplays it. But to the extent that he has to make sense of it somehow, it doesn't matter to him, because the guy's just an instrument for this long-standing, right? And I think that's one way that we make sense of these things. And the Freddie Gray, I think the cops who basically slapped Freddie Gray around in the back of a van in Philadelphia and he died, they were black. So, I mean, American policing has problems. The cop who killed Prince Jones was part of the Prince George's County Police Department, which is, Prince George's County has the highest per capita number of rich black people in the country. And they have chosen, for whatever reason, to have a police force. It's now, which was pretty violent. And to that extent, Coates was right to say there's a problem here. He didn't really sort of dive deeply into why rich black people would be willing to have their police force be violent, or why, even though the police force had a number of black patrolmen on it, that it tended to be really violent. Those are more difficult problems. What Coates did was say, it's the dream. It's the dream of whiteness that America has been lost in all this time, and the dreamers who want their perfect Christmases and prep schools. I think there's a more complex story there. And but your question was, I think I've sort of gotten a little bit away from your question. Racial violence. I think when I use the term racial violence, in the context that I'm using it in, which is a Southern context, it depends on the fact that there were no black cops in the South for decades. Eventually they got some, which is why Rudolph Fisher has a famous story called City of Refuge from the early 20s or early to mid 20s. It's set in Harlem. He was a black writer, and a migrant, a greenhorn sort of from the South, black greenhorn, kind of comes north and sees a black policeman. It's like the most amazing, miraculous thing he's ever seen, because you didn't have them down South. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about racial violence in a blues context, I'm talking about the bad old Mississippi that everybody knows about, by hands unknown. And there's been some great scholarship. There actually, somebody that I've worked with, Margaret Burnham, who was, believe it or not, Angela Davis's young lawyer back in the 60s. I once did some harmonica playing for her and her restorative justice project. She's coming to town on Wednesday, and we'll be talking about her new book, which is about by hands now known. Basically, she's going to talk about law and how law and lynching worked. So America, I'm not going to soft pedal that whole large category of stuff that we would all stipulate is racial violence, which is to say white on black violence. There is, of course, what I call retributive violence in my book, my 2002 book, which is black on white violence, not for criminal purposes, but for sort of the purpose of what's the word? Restorative justice in a broad, or score settling, contesting disciplinary violence, and that's the black outlaw. That's Sweetback's Badass song. That's I think America loves an outlaw. And I
So
think that a certain kind of black outlaw is very seductive, and including OJ, who's a curious outlaw, rich as he was, and celebrated as he was as a mainstream icon. But yeah,
So while we're talking about people's books, I think my last question, or the last one that we have time for,
yeah,
relates to your most recent one, Who's Blues? And you frame that book as kind of an exploration of the question of ownership, and sort of a dialogue between I think the people who say the Black Blues movement, where they say blues is a black form, Black
blues is black
American
music.
form,
Yeah,
right?
that meme,
And
right?
that
Yeah.
therefore they have black people have some ownership of this versus kind of the blues universalists who are like blues is for everybody.
No black,
um
no white, just the blues. That sort of meme. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
and this strikes me, a big part of campus conversations is this question of appropriation.
Hmm.
Appropriation has bothered me very much because it hinges on a very problematic notion of cultural property. Who owns what? And it seems to me, and feel free
Hmm.
to push back on me here
Sure,
if you
sure.
think that I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that the content of sort of white culture, right, is for everyone, right? So in other words, white communities can't claim white cultural content as such, and yet these other sort of minority communities can own cultural property. They could say, well, this is ours, we're going to police this. And so I think that, at least theoretically, this idea of cultural property, which is, I think, meant to acknowledge the
Mm.
agency of certain minorities, actually
Hmm.
inflames more racial grievance because, on the minority side, they see appropriations of their cultural property and say, how dare you? Right. And then on the other side, the majority says, well, we don't even get to own cultural property. If we just define it as our own, that becomes a racist gesture or an exclusionary gesture. Um, and so your engagement with this
Hmm.
question of cultural property in terms of the blues makes me think that you might have some thoughts about the idea of ownership in terms of
Mm.
cultural content.
I think about that. What interestingly enough, the first thing that came to mind was there's a celebrated chef, a sort of, I want to say a Mexican chef, but he's a white American guy, Rick Bayless,
Yes.
from La Frontera, right?
Yep.
A friend of my mom's. My mom is an old foodie. She's everybody's friends with her,
Mm.
and so she loves Rick Bayless and his elaborations of Mexican food. And that restaurant, the food is unbelievably delicious. He's obviously a kind of celebrity chef. And while Paula Deen can be a celebrity Southern chef, retailing Southern food, when Rick Bayless, I'm trying to steel man the claim. I can imagine that there's a certain kind of ambitious, sort of semi-elite, up and coming would be main guy for Mexican food of Mexican origin or of Mexican American origin, who might say, why is some white guy the guy at the top of the heap? So there's a certain amount of status jostling that's going on here. And to steel man it, the question really, of course, well, suppose Rick Bayless is like incredibly authentic and he's gone and he spent time with the mamacitas down in Mexico, and he's gone to the schools and he's really been mentored well and learned well, and his food's really good and it's authentic by standard. Or one question might be, well, does it have to be authentic? Maybe it's just really good, and maybe that fusion element is a part of how American culture works.
Maybe its
But
authenticity is part of the problem,
maybe it's
right?
part of the problem,
Is that the fact that Rick Bayless can do it suggests
right?
that
Oh,
there.
good point. Good point. I like the way your mind works, Adam. That
but
yes, no,
but I do
that
like
maybe,
your example of him too, because if you've ever, I'm
yeah.
sure you've watched his television program. He
I
also
haven't.
does. Oh no.
No.
Okay, this is old. This is maybe 20 years old now, but it very much exoticized it. So like he'd always be
Okay.
on site at this market in Jalisco to get just the right peppers and this kind of thing,
Okay.
which is a way to signify authenticity, but it's also kind of, to use the language of the campus left, exoticizes the
It's
other. It's
exoticizing,
yeah,
right? He's on a safari to get the
right.
real stuff, right? So I think reasonable people can say, okay, I get that there's something going on there, and I get why. But it's also about the money and the status. That's some of it, and I think one of the worries would be by the intellectuals who consider themselves the organic intellectuals of the cohort, the sort of celebrity Mexican chefs who are also intellectuals. That's where the problem is. It's not the guy with the food cart, right?
Right.
He doesn't give a damn. He could probably sell stuff on the street in front of the restaurant. He's happy. People are liking the food, right? But it's on that higher level. It's the elite that has a problem with this. When it comes to blues, let me think about this. So one of the things I try to do is I try to complexify things, and I do it in a number of different ways in my books. And if I try to go on, we don't have the time for me to go on. One of the things I do is say, well, if you think, number one, I talk about the transformation of the blues audience between 1960 and 1970. So that in 1960, you're just beginning to get white folks who are interested in country blues and those guys, right? The Mississippi John Hurts, and people are going off and trying to find old blues guys. And there's some Son House. They find these guys. Dick Waterman goes down to Mississippi and comes back with old blues guys. And you have young white blues players who are playing acoustic blues, Jorma Kaukonen and things like that. Now, and then you have the electric blues invasion. At the same time, young black folks are saying blues is like old people's music. I like soul. And so there's a sort of flip-flop where the blues audience, even as there's a sort of white blues explosion with the Butterfield Blues Band and Canned Heat and all of that stuff, the black blues audience is disappearing. Young white cohort, black cohort goes away. And I think one thing that happens, and then that changes blues culture forever, right? To this day, we're still living the after effects of that transformation. Now there's some complexity. So if you say, well, I want to reverse all this, like blues is black music, what do you have to fight against? If you say blues is black music, you have to first of all say that even the very best non-black blues singers, whoever you want to call the best, Mitch Kashmar can sing his ass off. I mean, there's any number of Bonnie Raitt. You have to say it's not really blues. Blues is black music. It's not really, and they need to give back what they've taken. But one thing you need to do is say, well, what happens if we go back to the year 1920, for example? And you realize that whites have been singing, recording, playing the music for a long time. And in fact, there were white blues songwriters. And so you have Lieber and Stoller doing Yakety Yak, Don't Talk Back in the rhythm and blues period. Doc Pomus writing Lonely Avenue for Ray Charles. So one thing you have to do is say, okay, so we're going to get rid of all those cooperative things where, we have black artists and white songwriters. What about like black songwriters in 1925 making money saying, learn how to sing the blues? I have that in my book. There were some black songwriters who were like trying to teach white people how to sing the blues. Wait a minute, you're making money teaching me how to sing the blues. Now you're going to come around decades later and say blues is black music. Okay. But there's a whole other element of complexity that I think is fascinating, which is to say, there's actually there's two things I want to heighten. One of them is that blues is no longer just about black and white in America. So one of the ways to deconstruct the blues is black music is to say, well, it's also, interestingly enough, it's a global music. It's gone way beyond America. And they're playing it in South America, and they're playing it in Europe. They're playing it in Japan. Turns out that and I did a whole deeply researched essay on the global spread of blues music. And it turns out that the Rolling Stones are really important. The sort of British blues invasion ends up being one of the main ways that blues rock in the rock form is kind of distributed around the world on like British air bases in Indonesia and stuff like that. Another thing is that B.B. King becomes a global ambassador. He goes to Japan early. Their blues scene hits critical mass early. So there's a lot of blues as a global music, which is to say, if you're going to say blues is black music, I might say, well, of course it is. But if we're going to be true blues people here, there's a little bit of double consciousness going on. It's blues is black music, blues is global music. Blues is, so it's black music, it's everybody's music. It's not just one thing. Why, if we really know what blues is about, why would we ever say it's just one thing? It's always two or more things in tension. Famous blues lyric that not a famous, but Rick Estrin, a sort of a well-known older white blues player who makes kind of comedy of the blues in some ways. I once told him off. We're friends now, but I told him off in a letter to Living Blues. I was young Garrett Felber saying, "Mau Mau the flat catcher," the who make the minstrel show out of the blues. He and I are friends now. I've chilled. But he has a blues lyric that goes, "Baby, I hate to see you go, but I love to watch you walk away." Heart, body, heart, love, and sex all together. It's more than one thing. And so, but there's something else that's important, which is to say there's two contemporary blues scenes, because they're the remnants of the Chitlin circuit, the black blues scene. That scene never actually died. It's still alive and well in the Mid-South, in Memphis, in Mississippi, in Chicago to some extent. It's an all-black scene. This is like when Henry Louis Gates did a famous article in the New Yorker blues playwright August Wilson, only the greatest blues playwright and one of the greatest black playwrights ever, probably the greatest, in the mid-90s was saying basically black theaters, we need theater for black people. And it was like an equity argument back then. Henry Louis Gates, to his credit, came along and said, well, there actually is an all-black theater scene. But the plays are they're Tyler Perry, they're not high art like Wilson, but they're people's art, and we need to know about this. Well, there's a black blues scene. There's a contemporary black blues scene called soul blues, blues, and just blues sometimes, soul blues, southern soul blues, southern soul. It is an all-black scene. The performers are 99.9% black. The audiences are, except for an occasional whitey like me, they're all black. The people who make the money, all black, except for a few record labels. The Malico was a couple of white Ole Miss guys actually, and that scene doesn't have any problem. It doesn't have a race problem. It just is its scene, and it's for the community, and it's for black people who like the particular mix. Meanwhile, we have some people, black and white, but we have some others who say, well, that's not really blues. That's more like soul. And so there's the mainstream scene, the festivals, the blues societies, the blues magazines feed to this scene. That is an integrated scene. It has since the beginning. And what we're having now is we're having, again, a kind of market share struggle. And so in a sense, what I'm doing in my book is saying, Billy Branch, Sugar Blue, wonderful guys I've hired for an event. I had a little bit of a problem with the way that they and others framed things in 2012, shortly after the Trayvon Martin thing. They framed the contemporary blues scene as a sort of zero-sum game, and how they had there were some true things that they said, but also there was some tendentious arguments that they made. And the key element here is that they have no reputation on the all-black scene. Their reputation's on the mainstream scene. It's democracy. We're struggling, and that scene is mostly white audiences, not entirely, but mostly, and global audiences, mostly non-African American, largely non-African American audiences. The white folks who kind of kept that scene alive and put sweat equity into that scene in the form of blues societies. I mean, crazy aficionado types, we all know them, the hardcore blues people. I love them. They're not the only fans that I've played for, but I played for a lot of them. And I think I took things a long way from where you started, but hopefully my method for dealing with these things is to try to entertain the complexities, to try to say more than one thing's going on at the same time. And in this case, to say, that scene's always available to these players, but they don't have names on that scene. They want white audiences and white promoters to love them and to pick them. And I can't blame any performer for wanting to be loved and wanting the gigs. And here's the paradox is that because they raised that stink, they're probably getting a few more gigs.
Well,
so this is American culture. It's what we mean by hurly-burly. People raise a stink, but it doesn't mean that I then have to get down and genuflect when you raise that stink. I have to think seriously. I revised that book, I'll tell you, and it was in galleys in the summer of 2020, and I was like, oh shit. There was some few things in it that were a little more abrasive, and I dialed a few things back. So I'm not embarrassed by that. It was a really tough time, and I thought, I don't want them coming after me with a gun or coming after me with, I don't want Billy calling me on, not a gun, but I don't want Billy calling me on the phone and just yelling at me again, right? I want to, that mostly, I didn't want me again.
Maybe one day for the second edition, you'll have to release the director's cut.
I got rid of, I don't know what it was.
Well,
It was
I
such
think
a
we're out of
interesting.
time, Adam. It's been a
Yeah.
great conversation, very wide ranging. And I hope people check out your book. Thanks again for coming.
It was my pleasure. Really, really fun. Thank you.
All right.